I'm the eldest of five, first and second generation Caribbean immigrants raised in the Bronx near Yankee Stadium. And by the grace of the heavens, my mother was a teacher. And so it was always very clear, even though we lived in the Bronx and, it has its story, but there was never a doubt as to what my path would be. And so I was very fortunate to go to a specialized public high school, thereby be exposed to things I might not have been otherwise, or let's say my local high school. And so by the age of, I want to say 15, and I recall my first sort of interaction with the markets being a social studies class, extra 5 points on your final grade, whoever picked the stock that performed the best over some period of time. I ended up winning that. And not that I did any really deep fundamental research and I was really that kid already, but I'm quite sure I just got lucky. And then coincidentally, I remember having a friend in school, my age, 15 years old, who was already trading stocks. And I was like, wow, what the hell? Fast forward around that same time, actually before the fast forward, a book came out by the name of Jack Schwager, quite well known in our industry, called Market Wizards. It was basically a biography of some of the world's best traders at the time. I read that book and I immediately knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And so I graduated high school at 16, went to NYU Stern, and by the time I was 17, I was cold calling at Shearson Lehman.
Wow. Yeah, so you were quite young when you left high school.
Yes, a bit, yes.
And what was your experiences like when you were, working on Wall Street?
Interesting. In one sense, I was ambivalent to a lot of things. Being young, at that age and where it was in my mind, for a long time, I was proud, if not always. I took it as a badge of honor to be the only Black guy in the room.
Yeah.
And, it only was after a certain period of my career where I started thinking, scratching my head as to what's happening here. I tell folks I'm the eldest of five. Each of us has degrees. One of my sisters has 2 degrees from Columbia. And so this idea that other ones are not out there, I began scratching my head because, I might be okay smart. I might be, but, surely I'm not some, right tail statistical aberration such that there should not be more in the room with me. And so after some point, multiple firms, multiple countries, buy side, sell side, it just began to become obvious to me that Wall Street on its own didn't have the will or the ability to bridge a divide between the raw talent I know existed in my neighborhood growing up and the seats with the guys around me, in the $1 million paychecks.
So if I understand that, you are a very gifted student, smart as far as trading is concerned, but there's a whole lot more to being successful on Wall Street and surviving inside one of these large financial institutions as a Black man coming from the West Indies.
Absolutely. I'm born and raised here. And as I mentioned, my mother, first generation, she came here when she was 18, my father, second generation. But, I'm old enough to know when resumes were still facts, for example. And I'm thankful forever, for example, that my name is Troy Alexander Prince. I absolutely remember the feeling walking into an office, the way I speak, and seeing that little shine in the lights where they weren't expecting a person to look like me. Or I absolutely know the idea of a resume coming through with a name that's difficult to pronounce, likely African, and somehow gets lost. I was very fortunate. My first job ever was teaching tennis right there in the Bronx. I found the love of tennis from my aunt. And in school, somehow I came across lacrosse. Wasn't like I was
Yeah.
looking for these sports. Just it wasn't football, but it was physical. And so, me being on the trading floor, the trading desk, and being a former tennis player, lacrosse player, there's a conversation there, just the way I moved and I lived, but that's not a normal thing that others would have. But that plays into that story. And so I just began to put things together that a lot of it is just about presentation, the lived experience. And clearly, if you're not able to either have those experiences or relate to them, that's a barrier, regardless of IQ and everything else, of once you're sitting there to interview, of people saying, that's our guy. Because in your mind, your brain is saying, he's like us. Ability is one thing, but obviously you want to sit next to folks who you feel like fit in. And so it just began, then it was immediately apparent to me that, like, okay, so clearly it's not just about IQ, ambition, hunger, talent. It's all that other stuff that when you put them together begins to open those doors. And that has to obviously be, what's the word, intentional. That doesn't just happen from having a kid from the Bronx who happens to be good in math.
But I think if I understand what you're saying, and just backtracking a little bit, you had the IQ, you had the smarts to do this, you had the competitive drive. In a way, you said you were lucky because of your name, so it wasn't obvious. So you got in the door a little bit easier, and you're gifted at sports as well. Tennis, lacrosse, coaching, training kids on that. So that gives you a higher level of confidence if you can play sports. I think that's one of the things that I've learned in my life is sports is very important to confidence, or some extracurricular activity that you've got. In a way, it builds your identity, but you still, Troy, had to learn how to conduct yourself once you were there.
That's right.
And I think this is the piece where you were headed to, is that somewhere there, it's your emotional intelligence. Once you're in the room, you are able to get through because of all the things we just talked about, but you still had to work with the white colleagues.
That's right.
And so how was that part? Just interacting with them. If you stood up for yourself because one of them was authoritarian and you didn't agree with what they said or were doing, or you had a bad day performance-wise in the markets, you survived it all. So there was something that you were doing.
Yes. So number one, white colleagues or not, just in that environment, a certain level of professionalism is expected. That's number one. Secondly, in that field, that industry, in a sense, there is somewhat also of a different kind of shielding mechanism happening because it's performance driven. And so, one is responsible for one's own performance, but in terms of that, the social, emotional, team environment performance, that's just something that, again, I was fortunate because it's not like when I started on Wall Street, that was my first time in a predominantly white environment. That's due to my parents. My parents worked very hard. I did have some private schooling. Again, being a tennis player, I went to specialized high school, and I'm sure at best, it was maybe 9% Black. And so part of that was also just, I was fortunate to have a certain amount of exposure to those environments beforehand. And I would say that's a big part of it. And so other than that, being more comfortable, I think put me in a position to simply focus on the performance and the social interaction, because I probably didn't have the challenges that others might have, having to, on a first level, just be comfortable being in that room, much less being comfortable forming relationships and bonds with your colleagues, much less to be able to focus on just pure performance. So I probably had a little bit of a step up there.
So mentally, walking into an environment that, if you're a Black person or a minority working into an environment where the majority is white, let's just put it out on the table, even if they're men and women, having some personal self-confidence and belief in who you are is very important, because how you show up and conduct yourself is really the key thing. And you've got to have the mindset that, you know, I can do this, I can interact with everybody else and make it work. So you've got to walk in there feeling, okay, I'm not really a duck out of water. I can do this just the same as everybody else. And you've got to come in with that energy.
I can appreciate that. And again, Hugh, you know, part of it for me was somewhat unique that, you know, I decided early what I wanted to do, and I knew this was the only thing I wanted to do. And so even I was confident, but I'm sure a good part of that confidence just came from the fact that there was just nowhere else I wanted to be. And barring that, you know, with the work I'm doing, and I guess we'll get into the conversation a bit later, barring that is the need for these young people, you know, like myself or the ones we're working with, you know, how else do we fill that, you know, if it's not your single drive focus, so you have a certain level of energy you bring naturally, if not, how do we still fill that tank of confidence, of ability, of the social capital, how you carry yourself to make it through, much less to just to make it through. And so
yeah, those things are very important. And what we might do is just switch to your business DNA discovery that you completed.
Okay.
And just for the our listeners' benefit, Troy is an adapter, which at sort of the high level means he's very flexible, adaptable. On days he can push hard on things. Other days he will take a bit more of a back seat or be a bit more flexible about the environment, which is probably good for going into a tough environment in many ways. But deeper down, he's got some very strong traits about being competitive. So I think we all can see that coming through in the things that Troy's done, just to work in capital markets, you know, be outstanding at school and tennis and sports. There's a competitive drive, and you're also creative and take some risks. So, you know, I think you've been a smart cat in some ways in how you've figured out how to position yourself as you've walked into these environments. But at the same time, with a lot of credit to you, with not necessarily a lot of help from other people. So, you know, you've had to do it yourself. And so, you know, that's to my mind, very impressive. But just tell us a little bit more about how you felt when you got back your business DNA results and what that said to you, and whether it revealed anything new or just confirmed what you already knew.
I would say for the most part, it confirmed what I already knew. You know, I've lived in 5 countries, speak a few of the languages. I do remember on campus being that guy that, you know, whether it was the lacrosse guys, the metalheads, you know, I've been in a mosh pit. I could be that guy going to different, you know, fraternity parties, whether they were the accounting guys or the, you know, the beer pong guys. Again, multiple countries. I looking back, yeah, it makes sense that, you know, I could be that guy. And I always joke, even before I knew of my behavioral, my being an adapter, that I always joke, and I always tell folks, you know, you could tie me up, blindfold me, and drop me somewhere, and if there's a market, coconuts or whatever, I'm going to make my way. So it makes sense.
How do you want the business community and these youths that you're bringing to the workforce to remember Troy Prince?
Wow, okay, that's a big one. I don't know. I guess there's 2 levels of that answer. One would be more practically speaking, with the work I'm doing in terms of the added value to the business community. It's this idea of, you know, this is not charity. All I'm suggesting is for the lens of for the recruiting lens to be shifted. Not charitable, not any change in the requirements, just shift the lens, shift where the camera's pointed.
Yeah.
Now, granted that there might be some edges needs to be smoothed out. There might need to be additional work and investment in these kids, which is the case. But it begins with just being a willingness to just shift the lens and invest with us to put in the work. And even if it's not for folks that are focused on or focused on a moment on DE&I and diverse recruiting, on a pure business standpoint, just for those that, as any business, your pipeline, your talent is the lifeblood of your business. So regardless of what that pipeline, the diverse statistics or needs there are, just finding talent. And I want us to be looked at as just a talent provider. And again, that's the beauty of this work you do, because regardless of what a person might look like, their name, how they wear their pants, this is who they are on paper. Let's bring some more objectivity to this process. Secondly, in that question, if I'm hearing it correctly, what comes to mind also is a sense of legacy and purpose. And,
Yeah.
for me, if not me, who? And if I, with my lived experience, am not willing to share, pass on whatever knowledge I've gained to the betterment of my community,